Some stories entertain, some stories inspire, and some stories change the way we see the world. Welcome to TrueTalesJourney, where every episode brings you a powerful real-life story that will stay with you long after it ends. Let's get started. Hi, I'm Ethan Brooks. I'm 29 from Washington, USA. My family called me a failure until they saw my name on the billion-dollar deal. The applause inside the packed convention center echoed through every corner of the room as hundreds of investors, journalists, and Fortune 500 executives rose to their feet. On the giant screen behind the stage, bold white letters flashed across a blue background. Nexora AI acquired for $1.2 billion. Cameras immediately focused on the smiling founder walking toward the podium. But 3,000 miles away in Seattle, one family froze in complete disbelief after seeing the live broadcast on television. The name beneath the headline was impossible to ignore: Ethan Brooks, the same son they had called a failure just 7 years earlier. Only a week before the historic announcement, Ethan had been preparing for the biggest meeting of his life inside Nexora AI's glass headquarters in downtown San Francisco. Investors from around the world were arriving to finalize what could become one of the largest technology acquisitions of the year. Every employee sensed history was about to be made, but Ethan remained surprisingly calm. Years of rejection had taught him that success wasn't built during moments of celebration. It was built during the lonely days when nobody believed in you. As he stared out across the city skyline, one painful memory quietly returned. 7 years earlier, 22-year-old Ethan Brooks sat nervously at the dining table inside his family's luxurious Seattle home. His father, Robert Brooks, proudly described the future of Brooks Manufacturing Group, the family company that had produced industrial equipment for nearly 50 years. Robert expected Ethan to join the business immediately after college, just as his older brother Jason already had. The plan had been discussed since Ethan was a child. Everyone assumed he would eventually work beside his brother, everyone except Ethan. Taking a slow breath, Ethan explained that he had accepted an offer to join a small artificial intelligence startup in California instead of entering the family business. He admitted that technology fascinated him far more than manufacturing, and that he dreamed of building software capable of solving problems on a global scale. The room instantly fell silent. Robert slowly placed his fork onto the table before staring directly at his youngest son. His expression revealed disappointment long before he spoke a single word. Robert laughed quietly before asking Ethan whether he truly intended to throw away a guaranteed executive position to chase what he called another Silicon Valley fantasy. Jason immediately joined the conversation, mocking startups as playgrounds for dreamers who rarely made real money. Even Ethan's mother, Linda, gently suggested that joining the family company would provide stability and security. Ethan listened respectfully before calmly explaining that he wasn't running away from the family. He simply wanted the opportunity to build something that belonged entirely to him. The conversation quickly turned into an argument. Robert accused Ethan of disrespecting generations of hard work that built the Brooks family reputation. Jason smugly claimed Ethan wasn't leaving because of ambition, but because he wasn't capable of handling real business responsibilities. Every sentence became more personal than the last. Ethan tried explaining that success looked different for everyone, but nobody around the table seemed interested in understanding. They had already decided his future for him years ago. The only mistake Ethan made was believing they might actually listen. Finally, Robert stood from his chair and looked directly into Ethan's eyes. With complete certainty, he declared that if Ethan walked away from Brooks Manufacturing, he would also be walking away from every privilege attached to the Brooks family name. There would be no financial support, no safety net, and no place waiting for him if his dream inevitably failed. Then Robert delivered the sentence Ethan would never forget. When you come back after losing everything, don't expect this family to rescue you. The following morning, Ethan quietly packed 2 suitcases, his laptop, a few books, and the small amount of savings he had earned through college internships. Before leaving, he walked through the empty house one final time, stopping briefly in front of an old family photograph taken years earlier. Standing beside him in the picture was his late grandfather, Arthur Brooks, the only person who had ever encouraged Ethan's curiosity about technology instead of dismissing it. Smiling sadly, Ethan whispered a quiet goodbye before closing the front door behind him without looking back. San Francisco looked nothing like the glamorous city Ethan imagined while growing up. His first apartment was a tiny one-bedroom space shared with his best friend Noah Carter, who had also left a comfortable life to pursue software engineering. Their furniture came from thrift stores. Their dining table was an old wooden crate. Some weeks they survived almost entirely on instant noodles because every dollar they earned went toward paying rent or buying computer equipment. Yet, despite the struggle, Ethan felt something he had never experienced before: freedom. The startup Ethan joined operated from a cramped warehouse converted into an office, where fewer than 20 employees worked long hours chasing impossible dreams. Nobody cared about expensive suits or family backgrounds. Ideas mattered more than titles. Every day, Ethan immersed himself in artificial intelligence research, writing code late into the night while learning from brilliant engineers who challenged him constantly. For the first time in his life, he wasn't simply following expectations. He was creating something entirely his own, even if nobody outside the building believed it would ever amount to anything. Back in Seattle, Robert regularly asked Jason whether Ethan had finally admitted defeat. Jason occasionally searched social media before laughing at photos showing Ethan working inside a modest office with outdated furniture. To the Brooks family, those images confirmed exactly what they already believed. Ethan had thrown away wealth, security, and family legacy for a fantasy destined to fail. During one Sunday dinner, Robert confidently declared that within a year, Ethan would return home asking for another chance. Nobody at the table disagreed. Nearly 18 months later, disaster struck. The startup's biggest investor unexpectedly withdrew funding after a broader economic downturn hit the technology sector. Within days, layoffs spread throughout the company. Employees quietly packed their belongings while uncertain futures waited outside the office doors. Ethan stood among dozens of talented engineers receiving termination letters that ended years of hard work in only a few minutes. Walking out of the building carrying a cardboard box, he suddenly remembered every warning his father had ever given him. For the first time, failure felt frighteningly close. That evening, Noah suggested they both begin applying for high-paying engineering jobs at established companies, but Ethan couldn't stop thinking about a software platform he had been secretly developing during weekends over the past year. The idea focused on helping hospitals use artificial intelligence to predict medical supply shortages before emergencies occurred. Noah listened carefully before smiling. Instead of searching for another employer, he offered to become Ethan's first partner. Neither of them had investors, wealthy parents, or guarantees. All they possessed were 2 laptops, one ambitious idea, and a willingness to risk everything. Using their remaining savings, Ethan and Noah rented a tiny garage office on the edge of the city where they worked day and night building the first version of what would eventually become Nexora AI. They often slept on air mattresses between coding sessions, surviving on cheap coffee and determination, while countless investors rejected their presentations without hesitation. Every rejection hurt, but each one strengthened Ethan's resolve to prove something much bigger than his family wrong. He wasn't building a company to impress Robert Brooks anymore. He was building it to prove that believing in yourself could be worth more than inheriting someone else's dream. The first year of building Nexora AI tested Ethan and Noah in ways neither had imagined. Every morning began with investor emails, software debugging, and cold calls to hospitals that usually ended with polite rejections. Every night ended the same way, with 2 exhausted friends sitting on the garage floor wondering how much longer they could survive. Their savings disappeared faster than expected, and there were weeks when paying rent seemed impossible. Yet every setback reminded Ethan why he had started this journey. If he gave up now, his family's opinion would become the only story anyone ever remembered. After nearly 8 months of constant rejection, Ethan finally secured a meeting with the purchasing director of a small regional hospital outside Sacramento. Unlike previous investors, the director wasn't interested in flashy presentations or business buzzwords. She wanted proof that Ethan's artificial intelligence system could actually help doctors save time and reduce shortages during emergencies. Ethan spent hours demonstrating the software using real hospital data. By the end of the meeting, the director quietly smiled and offered Nexora AI its very first commercial contract. It wasn't a huge deal financially, but to Ethan, it felt like someone had finally believed in his vision. Word spread surprisingly fast. Within a few months, several neighboring hospitals requested demonstrations after hearing positive feedback from the first client. Nurses praised the software because essential supplies arrived before they ran out. Administrators appreciated the lower costs and improved efficiency. Doctors trusted the predictions during emergency situations. For the first time, Ethan saw strangers relying on something he had built with his own hands. Every successful installation reminded him that real success wasn't measured by family approval. It was measured by the number of lives quietly improved through meaningful work. Back in Seattle, Brooks Manufacturing faced growing pressure from international competitors, offering cheaper products. Although Robert refused to admit it publicly, profits had begun declining for the third consecutive year. Jason insisted the company simply needed larger factories and more aggressive expansion. Rather than modernizing operations with new technology, he continued investing millions into outdated production methods. Senior executives privately questioned the strategy, but few challenged Jason directly because Robert still viewed his eldest son as the unquestioned future of the company. One afternoon, Robert unexpectedly received an email containing a news article about an emerging healthcare technology startup called Nexora AI. The article briefly mentioned its founder, Ethan Brooks. Robert read only the headline before dismissing it with a sarcastic smile. According to him, newspapers loved exaggerating small companies that rarely survived more than a few years. Jason laughed and joked that Ethan probably spent more time talking to reporters than running a real business. Neither of them noticed the article's final paragraph describing several major hospitals already adopting Ethan's platform across California. Meanwhile, Ethan's company continued growing beyond expectations. The garage office soon became too small, forcing the team to rent a larger workspace in downtown San Francisco. What began with only Ethan and Noah gradually expanded into a talented group of engineers, designers, and healthcare specialists who genuinely believed in the company's mission. Ethan insisted on interviewing every new employee personally because he wanted a culture built on respect rather than ego. He remembered exactly how painful it felt when people judged someone before giving them an opportunity. As Nexora AI attracted attention within the healthcare industry, venture capital firms that once ignored Ethan suddenly began requesting meetings. Among them was Victoria Hayes, one of Silicon Valley's most respected investors. During their first conversation, she admitted reading Ethan's original pitch nearly 2 years earlier and regretted passing on it. This time, she came prepared. After hours of discussion, Victoria offered a $25 million investment that would allow Nexora AI to expand nationwide. Ethan accepted, but only after ensuring the company's mission would never be sacrificed for short-term profits. The investment transformed everything almost overnight. New offices opened, engineers were hired across multiple states, and hospitals from New York to Texas began integrating Nexora AI into their operations. Industry experts started describing Ethan as one of the brightest young entrepreneurs in healthcare technology. Despite the growing recognition, Ethan never forgot where he came from. He still drove a modest car, worked longer hours than anyone else, and quietly donated software licenses to several nonprofit hospitals serving low-income communities. Success had changed his circumstances, but it hadn't changed his character. 3 years after launching Nexora AI, Ethan received an unexpected invitation to speak at the National Healthcare Innovation Summit in Chicago. Standing on stage before thousands of executives, doctors, and investors, he shared the story of building a company from a rented garage with nothing but determination and a belief that technology should solve real human problems. His speech ended with a standing ovation that spread across the entire auditorium. Unknown to Ethan, clips from the presentation would soon appear on business news channels across the country, including in his parents' living room. That evening, Robert happened to switch on a financial news network just as Ethan's interview began. For several moments, he stared silently at the television while reporters praised Nexora AI's rapid growth and estimated its value in the hundreds of millions. Linda watched quietly beside him, unable to hide a small smile of pride. Jason quickly dismissed the coverage, insisting that technology companies were often overvalued and destined to collapse. Robert nodded in agreement, but deep inside, something about seeing Ethan speak with such confidence unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Months later, Brooks Manufacturing encountered its biggest crisis in decades. Supply chain disruptions, rising production costs, and Jason's expensive expansion projects pushed the company into serious financial trouble. Several longtime clients quietly moved their contracts to more technologically advanced competitors. Emergency board meetings became increasingly common as executives searched desperately for solutions. Robert remained determined to solve the crisis through traditional methods, refusing repeated suggestions to modernize operations using artificial intelligence and predictive analytics, the very technology Ethan had been promoting for years. Around the same time, Nexora AI signed partnership agreements with several of the nation's largest healthcare networks, making it one of the fastest-growing software companies in America. Analysts began predicting that one of the world's biggest technology corporations would eventually attempt to acquire the company. Ethan ignored the speculation and continued focusing on product development, reminding his employees that headlines disappeared quickly, but great products lasted for years. Still, the growing attention placed Nexora AI firmly on the radar of global investors looking for the next billion-dollar success story. One rainy evening, Ethan received a phone call from David Sullivan, the longtime attorney who had managed his late grandfather Arthur Brooks's estate. David explained that Arthur had left behind a sealed letter with instructions that it should only be delivered once Ethan had truly built something of his own. Curious, Ethan agreed to meet the following morning. As he hung up the phone, he couldn't help wondering what his grandfather had known all those years ago that no one else seemed to understand. The next morning, Ethan sat quietly inside David Sullivan's office as the elderly attorney placed a sealed envelope on the desk. Across the front, written in Arthur Brooks's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 simple words. Open this only after proving them wrong. Ethan's hands froze before touching the envelope. Outside the office window, San Francisco carried on like any ordinary day. But deep inside, Ethan sensed that whatever his grandfather had left behind was about to connect his painful past with the extraordinary future he had fought so hard to build. With steady hands, Ethan carefully opened Grandpa Arthur's envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small photograph of the two of them building a homemade robot in Arthur's garage when Ethan was only 12 years old. Smiling softly from the picture, Grandpa had written, "The world will always tell you to become a copy of someone successful. The hardest thing you'll ever do is become the first version of yourself." Tears filled Ethan's eyes as he realized his grandfather had understood his dream long before anyone else believed it was possible. Arthur's letter continued by revealing that years before his death, he had quietly purchased a small number of shares in several technology companies because he believed innovation would shape the future. More importantly, he admitted that he had always watched Ethan with pride, because unlike everyone else in the family, Ethan never chased money or status. He chased solutions. Arthur ended the letter with one final sentence. The day your family finally notices your success, don't waste that moment proving them wrong. Use it to prove your character was always stronger than their opinion. Only 3 days later, executives from one of the world's largest enterprise software companies arrived at Nexora AI headquarters to finalize acquisition negotiations that had been ongoing for nearly 6 months. Lawyers, investment bankers, and financial advisors filled the conference room as the final agreement appeared on the large display screen. After hours of reviewing every detail, Ethan quietly picked up his pen and signed the last page. Moments later, the lead executive smiled and extended his hand. Nexora AI had officially been acquired for $1.2 billion, making it one of the largest artificial intelligence acquisitions of the year. Within minutes, financial news channels across America interrupted their regular programming to report the historic acquisition. Business websites published breaking headlines while social media exploded with congratulations. Outside Nexora AI headquarters, television crews gathered as employees celebrated years of sacrifice finally paying off. Ethan stood quietly watching his team embrace one another. He knew the billion-dollar headline wasn't really about money. It represented every rejection, every sleepless night, every investor who had laughed at his dream, and every person who believed he wasn't capable of succeeding without the Brooks family. Back in Seattle, Robert Brooks sat inside the Brooks Manufacturing boardroom preparing for another difficult financial meeting when the television mounted on the wall switched to breaking news. The anchor announced the billion-dollar acquisition before displaying a massive photograph of Ethan smiling beside the Nexora AI logo. The room fell completely silent. Every board member slowly turned toward Robert, waiting for his reaction. Jason stared at the screen in disbelief, unable to process that the younger brother he constantly mocked had just built a company worth more than Brooks Manufacturing had ever been at its peak. Later that evening, newspapers across Seattle featured Ethan's photograph on their front pages under headlines celebrating one of the state's most successful technology entrepreneurs. Linda quietly held the newspaper while tears rolled down her face. She remembered every birthday Ethan spent talking excitedly about computers and robotics, while the rest of the family dismissed his interests as childish hobbies. For the first time, she admitted to herself that Ethan hadn't failed the family. The family had failed Ethan by refusing to believe in the person he was becoming. The following week, Brooks Manufacturing officially announced severe financial restructuring after losing several major industrial contracts. Banks demanded immediate recovery plans, investors grew increasingly nervous, and board members openly questioned Jason's leadership decisions. During an emergency meeting, one director suggested that the company desperately needed advanced artificial intelligence systems to modernize operations and improve efficiency. Another director quietly mentioned that perhaps they should speak with Ethan Brooks, whose technology had already transformed industries across the country. The suggestion hung heavily in the room as Robert slowly lowered his head without saying a word. 2 days later, Ethan's assistant entered his office carrying an unexpected visitor request. She explained that Robert Brooks, Linda Brooks, and Jason Brooks had arrived together asking for a private meeting. Ethan remained silent for several moments before calmly agreeing. As the conference room doors opened, the Brooks family stepped inside for the first time since Ethan left home 7 years earlier. Robert looked older, Jason seemed noticeably less confident, and Linda struggled to hide her emotions. None of them could ignore the irony. The son they once called a failure now welcomed them into the headquarters of a billion-dollar company. Robert finally broke the silence. In a voice far quieter than Ethan remembered, he admitted that he had been wrong. He confessed that he had confused tradition with wisdom and believed success could only exist inside the business he had built. Looking directly at Ethan, he apologized for dismissing his dream before giving it a chance to grow. Jason reluctantly admitted that jealousy had played a larger role than he ever wanted to admit. Watching Ethan succeed without family money forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that confidence without effort eventually collapses under its own weight. Ethan listened carefully before responding. He explained that the greatest pain wasn't leaving the family business. It was spending years believing he needed permission to follow his own dream. Every sarcastic comment, every insult, and every prediction of failure had become fuel during the hardest moments of building Nexora AI. He thanked them not because they had helped him succeed, but because overcoming their doubt taught him resilience. Then he made something perfectly clear. Success had never been about becoming richer than his family. It had always been about becoming the person he knew he could be. Instead of taking advantage of Brooks Manufacturing's financial struggles, Ethan offered something no one expected. He proposed a strategic partnership between Nexora AI's enterprise technology division and Brooks Manufacturing, allowing the family company to modernize its operations and protect the jobs of hundreds of loyal employees. Robert looked stunned. After everything that had happened, Ethan still chose compassion over revenge. Ethan smiled gently before repeating Grandpa Arthur's words. Building something meaningful is always more powerful than proving someone wrong. For the first time in years, Robert understood what true leadership actually looked like. Several months later, Ethan stood on the stage of a university commencement ceremony where thousands of graduates waited to hear his speech. Holding Grandpa Arthur's old photograph inside his suit pocket, he shared one final lesson. Never let someone else's opinion become the blueprint for your future. The people who doubt you are often measuring your potential by the limits of their own imagination. Build anyway. Learn anyway. Dream anyway. As the audience rose in applause, Ethan looked toward the sky and smiled quietly. His family once called him a failure, but in the end, the billion-dollar deal wasn't his greatest achievement. Becoming the man his grandfather always believed he could be was. This is the end of the story. Thanks for watching True Tales Journey.